Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we are going to paint this Gladiola painting with a wild and free approach, and I hope that you enjoy it. If you'd like the real-time version of this lesson, you can find it up now in Critique Club. It's an hour and 21 minutes, and it is filled with fun tips and tricks, or you can enjoy the time lapse here. Now, I'm going to be using a variety of different things. I've got some stamps, bubble wrap, fountain pens, watercolors. I'm going to use some watercolor crayons. We're just going to throw a bunch of stuff at this painting, but I've really been enjoying using my liquid watercolors in my fountain pens. Now, I just want to quickly note the liquid watercolors I'm using in my fountain pens are the Dr. P.H. Martin's Radiance line, not the Hydra. So you want to make sure you get a dye-based watercolor that's not going to clog. But the thing I like about this is that I can sketch with them, and then once I add water and watercolor, they just kind of dissolve and they become part of the painting. But you get some interesting kind of like whooshes of color, and I don't know, it's just kind of freeing and fun. If you were going to do mostly this liquid watercolor, you do have to worry about light fastness, but where I'm adding in a lot of traditional light fast pigments on top, I really don't think it's going to be that big of a deal, because the amount of the liquid watercolor ink is so small. So, you know, just use your judgment there. I just wanted to put it out there. And I love just sketching this gladiola sprig, stalk, flower, whatever you want to call it. And I'm using a combination of, I think I started off mostly with orange, and I did use some green, but I'll be using all of those kind of like my warmer colors plus the greens. And I don't know, I think it's a nice jumping off point because you get to see some colors flow, you get to see some colors work together, but nothing is totally permanent. Now, I will say that fountain pen nibs are a bit sharp, so it will scratch a paper a bit, especially when you're doing those like grasses and you're kind of like moving quickly. I find that that can kind of scratch the paper. But if you go slowly, you shouldn't have that problem. But it can be a useful thing if you're trying to get the effect of veining, or if you do want to get some of those details kind of scraped into the paper. So here I've just kind of dripped some water on the paper. I just wanted to see what was going to happen naturally, and I wanted to mix up a fun color for the background, and I wanted it to be a blue, but I also wanted it to have a little bit of granulating properties. So you can see I have my M. Graham palette. I'm using some ultramarine, cerulean, and phthalo blue, and also a little bit of phthalo green, because I want to get this kind of like a turquoisey blue color with a little bit of granulation. And I know that the cerulean blue and the ultramarine blue will have granulating properties. That said, I really didn't see a lot of granulation in this background. I'm not exactly sure why, but I didn't. So yeah, I don't know. I used some Viridian, some natural Viridian from M. Graham in the foreground as well, kind of in the ground, just to kind of help anchor the painting. And also I thought it might give it some interesting texture. And then with my brush a little bit drier, with the sap green, I put in some grasses, and I knew they would fade out a bit, but that's all right. I just wanted to get that movement and that color and texture. And I can kind of see a little bit of a cauliflower forming in the sky, but I'm okay with that because I think it's kind of an interesting texture in an area where there's not a lot going on. And also by flicking in some paint, I've got some like crisp paint splatters up in the drier areas, and then I've got some more muted washy colors down in the lower parts of the painting. I let the background dry completely, and now I'm using a dagger brush and some cadmium yellow to just throw in some yellow in the flowers themselves. Cadmium yellow is such a bright, bold, somewhat opaque yellow, and I knew it would just really cut through anything that might be like in the flower. If I didn't want it there, I know it would like really hold its own against that. And I'm putting a little bit of sap green in the center of the flowers, kind of in the horn part of the trumpet, like kind of deep into the spout of it there, just to help push that color back. Adding some orange, adding some magenta, spraying it a bit, letting the colors run. I really just wanted this feeling of almost like a rainy spring day, fresh flowers, wild, artistic strokes of color, and I was really having a lot of fun with this. It didn't stress me out at all. And I was able to stay in that that kind of flow zone, even though I was narrating this live as I painted for Critique Club. So that's good. Sometimes it's hard to get into that flow state when you are painting and trying to talk about it at the same time, but I feel like this worked well. Maybe because I had recently painted the daffodils a couple weeks ago, and I was kind of used to that vibe. And that's on my YouTube channel if you want to check that out. So now I've let it dry again, and I'm going in with my fountain pen that has the magenta watercolor in it. And I'm just kind of sketching out the petals. I want to get the edges of the petals, get the shape of the flowers in there because I've lost quite a bit of it. Now, when I'm at this stage and I've got this kind of almost abstract composition, and I've also got a reference photo that I'm working from, I'll kind of meet the drawing in the middle. So if I see a shape that is very that's wanting to go one way, I will take that shape of color that I have on the paper, and that will be my my guiding principle, basically, as long as it fits in with that shape of the flower I'm trying to draw. So I'll kind of go back and forth. I'll look at the reference photo just for like the information on how is this flower shaped, how do the petals ruffle, how many petals are going on the flower. But then I'm also going to just look at what I've already drawn and the shapes I've already made with the paint and try to use those shapes to inform my petals. That way it doesn't feel like I'm fighting with anything. I never want the painting to look like it's forced, especially a painting like this where it is so free. I want it to really feel natural. Now there, obviously in that bottom petal, you see a lot of green in there. I had to draw the shape of that flower, even though it went over some area with green. But I'm not worried about that because when I approach a painting, knowing that it's probably going to be a mixed media painting, I know that I can pull in an opaque media. I'll be using some watercolor crayons in a bit, and that's going to help cover up any areas or add body to any parts of this composition that I need. And I'm going in with this pen with green ink, and I'm just kind of defining the stalks, and if there's any sort of like hip to the flower, like the unopened blossoms where you can see where they come together, where they've got the kind of the stalk approaching or attaching to them. So yeah, I'm just kind of like using whatever I feel like using, whatever I want to. Now this palette here is actually a palette of watercolor crayon shavings, and the watercolor crayons I recommend, I have two recommendations actually. My number one recommendation is the Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2. My second recommendation is, I was a nomination. My second recommendation would be the Lyra, I think they're called Aquacolor. They're a watercolor crayon made by Lyra, and they're also excellent. I would say they're 95% as good as the Neocolor 2s. And the Neocolor 2s, if you buy them open stock, they're like a couple dollars a stick. They're not too bad for what you get, in my opinion. And then if you need to sharpen them, just sharpen them over a palette and add some water, and there you've got the paint. You've got it as paint, kind of like gouache, ready to go. It actually reactivates better than gouache because it's like a softer material. So yeah, and that would actually make a really great portable gouache palette, but I think you would go through it pretty quick. I do notice that, like, I use up the pigment a lot quicker from the palette. And I've only had one crayon in my whole, like, I don't know, I've been using these for this brand probably since the late 90s. I've only had one paint crayon go bad, and if you see that yellow ochre that's all crumbly in there, the paint, that crayon just crumbled once, and I just put it in the palette, and it works fine from a palette. But other than that, I've never had anything expire with these crayons. I think they're a really great investment if you like to do this sort of art. Even if you're like thinking about getting into gouache, but you're not sure how much you would use the gouache, if you think you'd use the crayons more, I would recommend the crayons because you kind of get double bang for your buck. They're just wonderful. The only thing I could say about these crayons, the only con I would give to these crayons would be that in the red color range, it's really hard to get a super bright, like fire engine red. I think it's because these are an opaque medium, and once you make red opaque, it gets muted or almost pastel-y. So there isn't like a super, super true, lipstick red color. But other than that, I'm really a huge fan of these crayons, and as you can see, I have quite a few of them, but every time I use them, I'm like, oh, I need to use these more. They're so much fun. But yeah, save your shavings when you sharpen them, and then you've got a beautiful palette. And I've actually started filling another palette up with colors because I have a lot of colors, and it's fun. It's nice to be able to have those for when you want to go in with the detail, because even if you sharpen the crayon as sharp as it's going to go, you're not going to get a really fine line. But with the paint, you can dip in a small brush and you can get a fine line. And this is great for doing those stamens, because if I drew it in with a crayon first, and you're going to get some stray lines, some stray like crumble, or not crumble, but like grain of the paper. But if you go in with a wet brush, where you've picked up the crayon either from the tip of the crayon or your palette, you're going to get a much smoother line and a much more detailed shape. So you get thinner with them, and you can get nice crisp edges. And it's just, it's great to have that versatility, have them both ways. I'm adding some opacity to some of the petals here. I do like having some of that color from the background seeping through, but I also want to give them a little bit more presence and form, since, you know, those flowers are the focal image. They're the, and then the background, that's all just to support the focal image. And so I'm just going through, adding bits of opaque color detail where I see it, where I feel like it needs it. I don't want to cover everything up, but I do want to bring a little bit more no, I don't know if it's uniformity. I want to bring kind of a prominence to those petals and help bring them forward and give them a little more detail and a little more structure and a little bit more cohesiveness, I guess, because things can get kind of lost when you're doing a background all wet and it's abstract and it's got lots of colors. You know, it just kind of reins it all in, I guess. It's, you know, you're putting a belt on the dress, I guess. You're reining it all in. You're giving it some structure. And yeah, just doing in some little details. And I'm using a golden Taklon brush. The brush I will use with gouache, the brushes are the ones I would use with acrylics, or I should say the brushes I use with watercolor crayons are the ones I would use with gouache or acrylics. They are golden Taklon brushes. This is a number 2 Nova Da Vinci. No, it's number 2 Da Vinci. I don't think it's Nova. I think it's just like a student brush. But it works really well. But I usually use Zen Media, all media brushes a lot. But any golden Taklon brush works really well for the watercolor crayons. Initially, I was worried by how dark my painting had got in the first layer. I was kind of thinking I might leave some lighter areas, some white space from the white of the paper. But then I realized that the nice thing about having all those darks on my painting right off the bat, since I'm going to be using watercolor crayons, is that you have such a range. You have this huge range of value you can use, and value is how light or dark something is. So these highlights I'm putting on the petals, they almost look like they're white, but they're actually, it's yellow. It's yellow with some white mixed in. So, but it reads almost as white because there's such a value contrast. And I think having that value contrast is really what is making this image kind of get three-dimensional and pop off the page. And so that's something to think about. I know a lot of people are watercolor purists and they just want to use the white of the paper, and that's how I painted for so long. But then I realized that I'm missing out, and I really loved the mixed media format. I love reaching for different things and adding to my paintings. I love to add different textures, sometimes collage, sometimes stamping. And these stamps here are from a set I designed for Craft Stash. It'll be coming out in May. And I thought, because I think everybody needs a basic script stamp. Obviously, if you have a script stamp, just use whatever you have. I wanted to have something with a basic script stamp so somebody could add texture to something. And here, I'm stamping it. I wet the stamp, colored it with a watercolor crayon, stamped it, sprayed it with water, stamped it again, so I got that first impression, then the ghost print. And I'm going to do that a couple times. I'm doing that 3 times with the blue. I'm also going to do some with the with this little paint splash stamp that's in my kit. And or you could just splash some paint if you want to, but that just gives you a little controlled splash, so you can kind of direct where it goes perfectly towards the end of a painting when you might not want to have the splashing on the picture itself. But yeah, just adding and repeating these little bits of texture. It could be, you could just do the same thing on like a piece of mesh or burlap or a piece of bubble wrap. You can spatter directly from the crayons. That's what I'm doing here, just to add a little bit more of that that color elsewhere, because I think that when you know, if you stamp with a color, even if it's a paint splat stamp with a color, if you can like actually splash a little bit on with a brush, it helps marry that color in, helps integrate it a little bit better. But there's where I left it off. I really like how this came out. It was a lot of fun to paint, and I hope it encourages you to play with your supplies and give it a try. And if you'd like the real-time version of this tutorial, check it out in Critique Club. I'll have a link in the video description. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy crafting. Bye!